Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Karen Moline, and I'm with the Justice Research and Statistics Association. Thank you so much for joining us this afternoon for practical problem solving with NIBRS data. Right now, I'd like to introduce our moderator for this afternoon. Angie Baker is the director of the Oklahoma Statistical Analysis Center, which is housed in the Office of Criminal Justice Statistics at the Oklahoma State Bureau of Investigation. The unit provides program evaluation and technical support to local law enforcement in Oklahoma. The unit also provides administrative support to the agency. The Office of Criminal Justice Statistics is responsible for the annual Crime in Oklahoma report and the Oklahoma Crime Victimization Survey. Ms. Baker graduated from the University of Oklahoma with a BA in Sociology and is working on her MA in Public Administration at the University of Central Oklahoma. Before working in criminal justice, Angie worked with juvenile offenders in the clinical setting. Angie, I'd like to thank you for moderating today. You can take it away.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Angie Baker, like she said, and I am the director of the Oklahoma Statistical Analysis Center, which is housed at the Oklahoma State Bureau of Investigation. Today, it is my pleasure to welcome you to this webinar, Practical Problem Solving with NIBRS Data. This is a part of a series of webinars funded by the Bureau of Justice Statistics, U.S. Department of Justice, and hosted by JRSA. The goal of this series is to promote capacity building within the state statistical analysis centers and other justice-related agencies. You can watch other webinars from this series by visiting the JRSA website, and the webinars can be found under the Resources tab. Before I begin, I need to cover some logistical items. First, this webinar is being recorded for future playback. The link to the recording will be posted on the JRSA website. Second, today's webinar is being audiocast via the speakers on your computer and via teleconference. To access the audio stream via your computer speakers, please select Communicate, then Audio Stream. Once the audio broadcast window appears, press Play, which is the arrow button, and then your audio stream will begin. Third, if you do not have speakers or would prefer to use your phone, please dial the number provided in your registration email or on the Event tab located on the top left-hand side of the screen. There are a lot of people joining us today, so we have automatically muted the phone lines of participants to reduce the background noise. If you are not a presenter, then please keep your phone muted. If you typed in *6 to unmute your phone, please re-type *6 to remute your phone at this time. If you have any questions for the presenters, we encourage you to submit them using the chat feature on the right side of your screen. We found that the chat feature works better than the Q&A feature in WebEx for questions and comments. To use that chat feature, please select Host and Presenter from the drop-down box menu next to the text box. If you would like to communicate with the JRSA staff during the webinar, please submit your comment or question using the chat feature to Jason Trask, Karen Moline, or host. The webinar is scheduled for 1 hour and 30 minutes and will end promptly at 3:30 Eastern Time. If you have technical difficulties or get disconnected during the session, you can reconnect to the session using the same link that you used to join the session. You can also call WebEx Technical Support at 866-569-3239. Finally, we do value your feedback about this webinar, so in the last 5 minutes of today's webinar, we are going to ask you to complete a short survey. The information that you provide helps us to better plan and improve future webinars and to meet our reporting requirements. Now I would like to introduce today's presenter. Alan Wedd is a social sciences research specialist at the Statistical Analysis Center in Ohio's Office of Criminal Justice Services, which is located in the Department of Public Safety. Since joining the Ohio SAC in 2013, he has examined drug task force performance, opiate-related deaths, and the relationship between casinos and economic crime. Wedd has also analyzed index crimes in those major cities in Ohio. Currently, he is working on projects related to criminal justice program sustainability, domestic violence fatalities, police community relations, and longitudinal analyses of drug and violent crime. Alan uses a variety of techniques in his research, including crime mapping, data visualization, and data forecasting. He spends much of his time working with data from the Ohio Incident-Based Reporting System. Wedd earned his BA in Psychology from the College of Wooster and an MS in Cognitive Neuroscience from Michigan State University. At this time, I would like to turn this webinar over to Alan Wedd.
Wonderful. Thank you, Angie, for that wonderful introduction, and thank you, everybody, for tuning in today to my webinar, Practical Problem Solving with NIBRS Data. Like Angie said, my name is Alan Webb. I'm from the Ohio Statistical Analysis Center. We're located within the Department of Public Safety here in Ohio, and within there I'm located in the Office of Criminal Justice Services. A couple things I wanted to mention just very quickly before I get into the webinar. There's been a lot of interest, I've heard, in NIBRS data recently. So if you like the material from the webinar, there's a couple other things I just wanted to point out to you. The Journal of Research and Policy that's coming out soon, I believe, will have the special edition focused on NIBRS data. So there should be some pretty good information from that you might want to check out. Also, there are a couple other webinars that discuss the usage of NIBRS data for sort of the same things that I'm going to be talking about here today. How can you help local stakeholders solve problems with the data that you have available? One of them was use of incident-based data as a tool to address policy. I believe that came out last year. And the other one was actually from our host today, Angie Baker, police planning and problem solving through incident-based reporting data. So again, if you like some of this stuff, if you want to follow up on this, feel free to go ahead and check out those resources. So without any further ado, I'm going to go ahead and get into the presentation here today. Like I said, practical problem solving with NIBRS data. And here's a brief outline of what I'm going to be talking about here today. I'm going to start off by giving you just sort of a brief overview of NIBRS and OIBRS. NIBRS is the National Incident-Based Reporting System, and OIBRS is just the Ohio version of that. It's the local version that we have here in our state, and it's the one that I primarily work with to inform our stakeholders. I'm going to sort of cover what they are, why they're useful, advantages and disadvantages, and just sort of frame why I think these are important tools to have, and give you a taste for some of the things that can be done with them. I also want to talk about two specific research studies I did. First is the impact of casino opening on economic crime. So that was here in Columbus, right here in the capital of Ohio. We had a casino open, and some individuals from the Columbus Police Department actually wondered, is that going to have any sort of negative impact on economic crime? And so we used OIBRS data to hopefully try to address that problem for them. The other one that I'm going to talk about is domestic violence homicides. As I'm sure you all well know, domestic violence has sort of been emerging as a big issue in the national consciousness here recently. There's a lot of sort of different initiatives throughout different states and even within states to try to tackle this problem. And I'm going to talk about some of the work I've done with a group of dedicated individuals here in Ohio who are really committed to trying to help victims of domestic violence. Lastly, my fourth point there, using the NIBRS database structure is sort of poorly named. Just a couple quick slides on how the NIBRS database structure can be used to be replicated by other groups of people who want to set up their own database for crime analysis or for that type of thing. Don't worry, I promise it'll make more sense once I get into it here. And then I'm just going to talk about a couple of brief conclusions, try to summarize what I've discussed here today and a couple lessons that I've learned along the way. So I'm just going to go ahead and get right into it here. So NIBRS is the National Incident-Based Reporting System. Now, it's part of the FBI's Uniform Crime Reporting Program. That was established back in the late 20s, early 30s, I believe. And then the NIBRS system came along in the late 80s as a way of sort of collecting more detailed information about crime and trying to adapt to some of the needs that people had as we've sort of developed more technologies and a better understanding of crime. This is one of the primary sources for crime data here in the United States. You see our system and NIBRS together, along with things like the National Crime Victimization Survey and a couple other crime surveys that take place locally or among juveniles, that type of thing. It's a really, really useful indicator for a whole different group of people, a bunch of different types of people, criminologists, legislators, people who are in municipal planning, law enforcement, just tons of people can really benefit from this type of data. And that's why I'm really delighted to be talking about it with you here today. You know, it's a system for reporting crimes known to the police. So this is for a crime that gets reported to law enforcement. That information from law enforcement then gets aggregated at state levels, and then the state level data generally gets aggregated at the national level to provide information sort of nationally about what's happening with crime on a year-to-year basis. There's a whole bunch of different types of fields that get collected in terms of NIBRS data. So there's information on things like offenses that take place. So where are they located? Is it a residential building or commercial building, that type of thing? Was any sort of weapon used? And if so, what type of weapon? Was the crime just attempted, or was it actually completed as well? Other fields like victim or suspect information, you've got information on the relationship between a crime victim and the person who is suspected to have committed the crime. demographic information, so things like race and sex and age and all those different things that can really sort of help pinpoint who within a specific area is being a victim of crime and who's likely to be a suspect in those situations too. So it's a really, really rich source of data, and it is really important, I think. And actually, I sort of just want to address that at the top, right? So why does NIBRS matter? If you're going to be sitting through this webinar and having to listen to my voice for the next 45 minutes to an hour, I should sort of try to prove to you guys, right, why I think this stuff is important. So I want to address that at the top. And the first reason is that I think almost everybody cares about crime data. Now, I'm not just talking about people who are in the criminal justice field or researchers or people who work for state government, that type of thing. I think almost everybody generally cares about crime data. It's one of the rare types of information that I think appeals to the average person. Nobody wants to be a victim of crime. Nobody wants to really live in an area filled with crime. And people sort of want to know the status of that. We get requests from newspapers here in Ohio fairly often to talk about what the current state of crime in Ohio is and how things have changed over time. And I think that's because it's something that people really care about. So one of the first things I want to mention right off the bat is that the information you can get from this data set is very meaningful. People do care about this, and it can be informative for a whole host of different types of people. The second reason I like NIBRS is because it provides information on crime trends at multiple levels. So you can go about analyzing things that happened in terms of offenses, right? So what does your average robbery look like, or what does your average assault look like? You can pair up information, so you can look at the relationship between suspect and victim. You can pair the NIBRS data with other different types of data like census data, and I'll show you how I did that here a little bit later to give you a sense of populations that are over or underrepresented for certain types of crime. And so I think it's really sort of flexible in that way, and that's why it's really nice. And you can also aggregate information at the zip code level or the state level or all these different levels depending on sort of where you want to work at and what type of group you want to be able to target with your analysis. Lastly, I really like NIBRS and just sort of data in general because it enables you to make informed decisions. A lot of times as human beings we can sort of be blinded by our own biases and that type of thing, or you just don't have a good sense of what's really going on unless you have accurate data. With NIBRS data, it enables you to make informed decisions about really important things that matter to people. And so that's why I'm a big proponent of this database and being able to work with this database. So hopefully that was convincing. And I want to talk a little bit now about NIBRS, which is just the Ohio version of the National Incident-Based Reporting System. So NIBRS is currently at about 60% of law enforcement agencies on our state report to us. Now that includes everybody from the big police departments like Cleveland or Cincinnati or Columbus, all the way down to things like state parks and universities. So we are very fortunate to have representation from 85 out of the 88 counties here in our state. So there's still a handful of counties we don't get data from. But at least within almost every county in our state, we do manage to get some data. So that lets us do things like calculate crime rates, keeping in mind we only have a sample and not an entire population like some other NIBRS states. I think there might be currently, I believe, 15 states that have full NIBRS reporting. And so that's great to have. But even if you don't have that, I want to show people and sort of try to make the case that there's a lot that can be done with this data. There's just a couple things you're going to have to keep in mind here and there. Fortunately, we have a lot of representation from the big law enforcement agencies. So that covers about 70% of Ohio's population. So our population right now is approximately 11.5 million. And we have anywhere between, let's just call it 8.5 million people covered by our database or covered by law enforcement agencies that report to our database. So we get a good amount of the population here. We also, and this is sort of a back of the envelope calculation here, we get about 80% of crime that's reported to law enforcement gets covered by our database. So this is sort of based on the idea that crime tends to be more prevalent in big cities than it is in small cities. And since we have representation from the bigger cities here in Ohio, we think we actually get a little bit more than 70% of crime, sort of like what you would expect just based on population figures. So that's the database that we have to work with. And it's sort of a good time to be working with this, actually. I've heard sort of rumblings from multiple different people that there's going to be a big push here towards having NIBRS data available and trying to make more usage out of NIBRS data. So this is actually a really good time to be tuning into this webinar and learning a little bit more about NIBRS. And if you're already a NIBRS practitioner, hopefully it'll give you some tools or some resources that can help improve the quality of your work. So I want to talk a little bit about why NIBRS has some advantages that make it really useful for this type of research. Compared to some other crime data sets, it's got a little bit more detail. Actually, it's got greater detail than some of those other data sets, and that's sort of one of the big advantages. You know, compared with UCR reporting, it's not restricted to a limited number of offense categories. You can have offense definitions meet different criteria at the state level. So based on specific state laws, you can have those things coded in your database, and then from there, you can also sort of translate those codes to the federal level, so you can compare things that way too. So it's really sort of nice in that sense, in that you can analyze data in multiple different levels of offense code. Like I've already mentioned before, tons of detail on individual crime incidents. I'm going to use the term incident a couple times here, actually. So it's the National Incident-Based Reporting System. I just want to clarify that with NIBRS, an incident, it gets defined as one or more offenses committed by the same offender or group of offenders acting together at the same time and place. So when I'm using terms like incident, that's what I'm referring to there specifically, and that's sort of based on the FBI's NIBRS guidelines. Other advantages of the database, I've already mentioned some of its flexibility, that you can sort of look at data from a couple of different levels. And it's also fast and easy for law enforcement agencies to submit data. I'm not entirely sure about other states, but I know that here in Ohio, there's a lot of NIBRS-compatible programs that interface with existing law enforcement technologies. So it's not like law enforcement has to go out and get specialized NIBRS reporting equipment in some cases. Oftentimes, it'll be that there's vendors that can sort of interface with what law enforcement currently has available and allow them to go ahead and send in their data. So I really think this is a nice system. It does have a lot of advantages. Unfortunately, there are a couple disadvantages, or sort of maybe drawbacks that I just wanted to address at the top. And these are things that, as I work with NIBRS data, I always try to keep in mind. And hopefully I want to be able to discuss this so people are sort of aware of these potential issues or potential pitfalls. In preparation for this webinar last week, I was reading an article that described this as a very complex system and very confusing. And just the sense I've had from reading some things online and from talking to people, it maybe seems a little bit intimidating, or maybe people have concerns about data quality with NIBRS. I want to try to address some of those issues specifically and talk about what can be done about them. So hopefully people feel a little bit more comfortable working with this data set. So one big disadvantage of NIBRS is that crime is underreported to law enforcement. So the second that you're working in any sort of data that has to do with crime, you know that you're not getting everything. So just sort of by definition, you don't have a perfect data set to work with. And it's good to sort of acknowledge that up front so you don't have too many concerns about that down the road. It doesn't mean that data isn't useful. And it doesn't mean that you can't paint an accurate picture or a meaningful picture based on what you do have available to you, right? This is sort of the so-called dark figure of crime, right? The crime that doesn't get reported. People do that for all sorts of different reasons, right? Sometimes people don't even know if a crime has been committed. My apartment is so messy, for example, that you know, you could take something out of there and I probably wouldn't notice for weeks. Other people fear reprisals at different levels from people who have done them wrong. Other individuals just have a systematic sort of distrust of the police and they don't want to get them involved in their lives. So for all these different reasons, crime gets underreported, and that's just sort of a good thing to always sort of keep in mind as you're working with crime data. One other issue that I've seen people talk about with NIBRS data is the issue of data quality. So people have some concerns about this, and I actually wanted to point people to some really terrific work that's been done by some folks over at the West Virginia Statistical Analysis Center trying to address some of these issues. So I've got two of their papers cited there, sort of their initial work, and then later they went back and sort of went to validate their work, and it turned out pretty well. They also have a webinar that they did through JRSA here a little while ago, and I've got links to all that stuff in the resource section at the end of this. So if you're interested in seeing what they've done, go ahead and check that out at the end of this PowerPoint here once you can download it online. There's sort of like 3 specific issues that they lay out that are good to keep in mind. For example, true versus false zeros is important to sort of be aware of. So let's imagine that a law enforcement agency reports that there are 0 murders for July. Now, is that because there were 0 murders for July and they had none to report? Is it because they haven't had the time to get around to reporting that data to you yet? Is it because there's a glitch in their system and for some reason that wasn't sent over? Is it because they're backed up on paperwork, they haven't been able to get that type of thing entered? If you see a 0 in a data set, right, is that really a 0 or is it a false 0? It's what they sort of call true versus false zeros. They lay out some really nice methodologies for being able to address those potential problems, and it really is a great resource if you just want to check those out. Even if an agency does report data, what if it's incomplete sometimes, right? Or what if there's a data entry error and you get a number that looks kind of fluky to you? That's why looking at outliers is also a way that they've sort of described to be able to sort of deal with problems, is they have some nice methodologies laid out for identifying outliers and what to do if you encounter those, right? How do you deal with those potential problems in your data set? And lastly, non-reporting agencies. So even within 100% NIBRS states, I don't think everybody reports at the same time or maybe even at all some years if they maybe have issues. Here within Ohio, this is a problem that we have to deal with, right? Because not every agency does report to us, so what do you do about that? Again, they really lay out some wonderful methodology, very straightforward. The webinar and both of those articles are terrific resources. So if you have any concerns about data quality, and I know that that tends to be one of the areas that people tend to have some worries about, feel free to go ahead and check that out. And lastly, the sort of level of analysis that you work at with NIBRS data matters, and sometimes people don't quite pay attention to it enough. So there's been some work on looking at, like for instance, particular types of crime. Now, when you have an incident reported in the NIBRS system, that can occur, there can be multiple different types of information, right? Maybe one incident has 2 suspects and 5 different victims. So depending on what level you're looking at, if you're looking at the offense level, well, that would be a count of 1. If you're looking at the suspect level, that'd be a count of 2. If you're looking at the victim level, that's a count of 5, right? If you're compiling crime statistics that way, you're going to get different results depending on what you look at specifically. So it's always a good mind to sort of keep in mind the level of analysis when you're going to do any work with NIBRS. And so having sort of talked about those disadvantages, I don't think any of those are completely prohibitive. It's nothing that can't be overcome. People have done some very good work in sort of laying out methods for dealing with this stuff. And I believe that there's actually, at the federal level, a push to work on some imputation guidelines for the UCR, for the Uniform Crime Reporting Program that might spill over and be useful for some of this NIBRS data stuff too. So I think those are some good things to keep in mind, but we're not going to let it scare us off from working with this data. Okay. So enough talk on the background here. Let's get into some actual research here. Back last year, we got contacted by the Columbus Police Department Economic Crime Unit. So we're located here in the state capital of Columbus, and they reached out to us for a data request. Now, we get data requests from all different types of organizations here, universities, newspapers, law enforcement, that type of thing. But they actually came to us with a research question instead of, you know, how many homicides were there in July last year, that type of thing. And they wanted to know if economic crime was increasing as a result of the recent casino opening. So there had been a casino that had opened about, I want to say, a year or so prior to them contacting us. And they wanted to know, is that going to have any impact on crime that they should be able to deal with? Now, as a researcher, I think this is a terrific research question, and I'm glad that somebody sort of brought it to me. I just want to mention here that one of the themes from the webinar last time, I don't know if you tuned into it, but the use of administrative records webinar, Stephanie Lopez-Howard and Samuel Gonzalez, one of the major themes I got out of that webinar was sort of the importance of networking and making sure people are comfortable and familiar with you and trying to make those connections. This is one of the ways that it came about to us, is so we had the opportunity to work on this project and to use NIBRS data in a meaningful way, just because of some of the connections we've made here over the years. So I went ahead and I looked at some of the research, and it turns out that the previous work on the relationship between a casino and crime is decidedly mixed. And I've cited a whole bunch of papers there, and the results from those papers are all kind of different. In some cases, the evidence looks like crime actually decreases when you open a casino in the area. In other cases, it looks like crime increases. In other cases, it looks like crime, some types of crimes increase, other types decrease, and sometimes it appears to have no effect at all. So I couldn't really confidently say what direction this might be going in without looking at the data, so we had to go ahead and conduct a study for these guys. So we talked a little bit and talked a little bit about the types of offenses they normally deal with and that type of thing, and we went ahead and designed sort of an analysis based on the NIBRS data that we have here. So what we did was we took 8 different offense categories. Oh, and I should mention that there's 2 parts to this. I'm going to go through this first one a little bit quickly, just mostly because it's sort of based on state laws, and the second part of it is more based on federal UCR stuff that everybody's going to have access to. But they gave us 8 different offense categories that lined up with our state laws here, and I've listed those right there. You've got passing bad checks, forgery and counterfeiting, identity theft, misuse of credit card, telecommunications fraud, receiving stolen property, fraud, and theft. I want to point out that these are listed as state statutes, but I've gone ahead and put the federal UCR codes there as well. That's what this stuff gets coded into. So when I talked earlier about how you can use this data at multiple different levels, you might want to analyze this in terms of your own state laws, or you might want to frame it in terms of what's going on nationally. So that's just something I wanted to point out that we can keep in mind. So those are the different categories that we looked at and we decided to work with. And then we had to figure out a sort of time frame that we wanted to look at for this research, and this proved to be a little bit tricky. I actually went and talked to a researcher from Jacksonville State University in Alabama that had done a decent amount of work with casino and crime, particularly with riverboats down there, and he said it's a tough problem to solve. In some cases, the effect of the casino on a crime occurs right away. And other times it takes a little bit while as people sort of blow through their savings and then have to turn to other means to be able to keep gambling. So we really decided on 3 time intervals that we wanted to look at here to try to see if crime increased after the opening of a casino. And each one of these was sort of designed to take something specifically into account. And they were also designed to have crime data from before the opening of the casino, so we could compare that to crime data after the casino opened. And I realize this is a little bit of a complicated slide here, so I just want to reiterate that. So there's 3 different groups that we're looking at here with those 8 different types of crime data I just mentioned on the previous slide. We're going to look at this data before the casino opens and then after the casino opens to see if there's an increase in crime that we might be able to attribute to the casino. We did this across 3 different time frames. So that first one, we just compared crime in Columbus for 100 days before the casino opened to 100 days after the casino opened. Really sort of straightforward pre- and post-comparison. We did this because the time window was fairly narrow, so if there was a difference that sort of happened quickly, we'd be able to hopefully find that in the data without running into issues like if we had a longer time window, maybe some other stuff would have an effect on economic crime that would wipe out the effect from the casino that we wouldn't be able to detect. So that's why we did that. One issue with that potentially is that this occurred throughout different seasons, and as we know, seasonality has an effect on crime. So to account for that, we looked at a year before the casino opened and a year after the casino opened. So we just sort of widened that window from that first time interval. Okay, so 365 days before to 365 days after. And the reason we did that is to sort of deal with those seasonal effects. So now this isn't taking place in a certain season that we're looking at. It really is sort of working over multiple seasons. So we don't have to worry about it that way. But it's not quite perfect because, you know, if there's some sort of yearly trend taking place in Ohio that's either reducing or increasing crime, we might catch that instead of the effect of the casino on our results. So it does help us answer some questions, but it might also raise others. So that's why we have this last one. The same dates as, I'm sorry, that shouldn't say above, it should say to the right. We compared 100 days after the casino opened for the year that it opened, and then we also compared it for the prior year. So that's what that third blue box should say there. I apologize for that mistake. So it should say 100 days after the casino opened for the year that it opened, and then those exact same dates the year before. And that sort of deals with some of the seasonality effects and gives us sort of one more comparison we can make. And so what this nicely sort of sets up is 3 different ways that we can sort of look at all this data together. So I hope that makes sense. I'm going to go ahead and move forward and show you the results of what we came up with here. Oops, actually, no, I'm not. I have to talk about some of those methods I discussed at the top. So have to account for data quality, so we don't have any data quality issues. Fortunately, we had no zeros reported to us by Columbus Police Department, and this is, again, sort of one of those nice things about having the relationships that I'd mentioned and that has been discussed in a previous webinar, is that we're able to, reach out directly to the police department and say, hey, is there anything that you haven't reported yet, or are we still waiting to get some of your data? And, we had some assurances that it was complete, so that's always nice to see. We even went through and did some outlier inspection. Nothing really jumped out at us as problematic, so we thought that we were pretty good on that front. In terms of level of analysis, we just did it sort of one offense for and this is sort of the FBI's language here, each distinct operation of a crime against property. Basically just we're counting one sort of incident as one offense here. You get some weird problems with property crimes sometimes in NIBRS data, like, if somebody breaks into multiple hotel rooms, that can count as multiple offenses. But for our purposes, it was just sort of one offense. We were just counting one time. And so that's sort of what we tried to account for when we did this analysis, so we could feel comfortable with it. And then here are the results. So on the y-axis there is the average number of weekly economic crimes in Columbus. And then across the bottom there are those 3 different time periods I talked about. So the first one is 100 days before and after the opening of the casino. The second one is the 100 days after the casino opened, and then the previous year, those exact same dates. And that last one is 365 days before and after. Your blue bar there is before the casino opened. So that was your average number of economic crimes per week before the casino opened. And the red bar there is after the casino opened. So the exact same thing, average number of economic crimes per week after the casino opened. So I'm going to give you a quick second to take that in while I get a drink of water here. And so what probably jumps out at you here is that across those 3 different groups, crime seems to have decreased after the casino opened across those 3 different time periods. Now what we're doing is we're combining all those 8 different offenses that they told us they were interested in. We also split out the data because there tended to be a lot of theft offenses that they had to deal with too. But generally, this is the trend that we saw. There wasn't really any instance where we saw a significant increase in the amount of crime across those 3 conditions. And so for people out there that have a stats background and that type of thing, all those differences there are significant, and those lines represent your standard error bars. And you can see that confidence intervals don't really overlap there. So basically the sort of takeaway that we had from this is that it really sort of looked like crime might have decreased after the casino opened. Now, we're not attributing that directly to the casino, but we're sort of able to rule out any possible effect of it increasing due to the casino, or at least be pretty confident that it's not increasing because of the casino. So we took this information, we went ahead and wrote it up, and they came back, and we actually talked with them for a little bit about the results, and it turns out one of the individuals working for the police department had a mentor in, I believe it was New Jersey, that had encountered this situation before when they had some casinos open up. And one of the trends that they saw was that embezzlement offenses tended to increase after the casino had opened. So his sort of hypothesis, and the reason they were sort of interested in this data analysis, was that thought maybe, okay, so somebody has a gambling problem, they blow through their savings, and then they go to their job and they embezzle money. Okay, so maybe that was increasing, and that wasn't actually something we included in our first analysis. So I said, okay, let's go ahead and go back, and we will see if there's any change across those 3 different time frames in terms of embezzlements. And the reason I wanted to mention this here is because that is a NIBRS code UCR code 270 that would be available for everybody with a NIBRS database. So this would be the same type of analysis that somebody could run if they were interested in it. Yeah, so like I said, 3 different time frames. Let's just go ahead and move on to the data here. Again, your y-axis there is the average number of weekly embezzlement crimes in Columbus. The bottom is your 3 different conditions, before and after both 100 and 365 days, and 100 days after on those sort of back-to-back years that we looked at, with the blue bar being before the casino opened and the red bar being after the casino opened. Now, you'll notice that the trend that we see here is a little bit different than what we saw before. So in our first analysis, it ended up looking like crime had actually decreased after the casino opened. But here what we tended to see was a little bit of a reversal, right? So it almost looks like crime is increasing after the casino opened. However, those differences there are non-significant, meaning we can't rule out the possibility that, it'd be more precise to say that crime did not appear to actually increase after the casino opened. The magnitude of that difference is not quite great enough. And if you look at those standard error bars, there's a lot of overlap between those sort of different confidence intervals. So we really wouldn't be comfortable saying that there's an increase in embezzlements, but it almost looks like there's a trend in that direction. And so one of the things that occurred to us, and I'm going to go ahead and move to the next slide here. All right, so there's no increase in embezzlements. It looked like it maybe was headed in that direction, but like I pointed out, that difference was non-significant, so we don't want to make too much of that. But what if there's sort of a trend towards significance? So what if maybe it took people a little bit longer to start embezzling, right? It took a little bit longer for them to go broke. This is actually one of the big issues with looking at the effect of casinos on crime is it's sort of what's called distributed over space. So maybe somebody from somewhere else in Ohio comes to visit Columbus, goes to the casino, gambles, and then they go back home to wherever they were from and embezzles, right? We wouldn't be able to see that in our database, but for the purposes of the Economic Crimes Division in the Columbus PD, they just really needed to know what was going on here. So we thought, okay, maybe the data suggests that there's a trend towards significance, right, that there might actually be an increase in embezzlements, sort of like what they've seen elsewhere. And so one of the ways that we thought we'd address that is with a forecasting or sort of a predictive model. I don't want to go into too much detail here about this, but I did want to show people, if you have SPSS, sort of where sort of this tool is. I'm not as up to date on the SPSS standard packages versus the add-ons. I know that we have a couple add-ons here, so I'm not quite sure if this forecasting stuff is available for everybody that has SPSS or if you have to get it separately, but just wanted to sort of orient you to where it was and talk just sort of very briefly about what it was that I did to sort of build a forecast, right? So do we think that maybe over the next 6 months is embezzlement crime going to increase, maybe perhaps as a result of that casino? So what we basically did was a forecasting through there. It uses time series analysis. One of the things I want to mention is that if you're interested in reading up on some of this stuff, I'm going to have a link in the resources section at the end for everybody. So time series analysis is you basically look at a single variable over a period of time. So in this case, our variable is just number of weekly embezzlements, and we're going to look at that for a period of time. I actually went kind of far back. If you look at my slide there, I've got stuff from like 2010. We just sort of wanted to go back a ways to see if we could be fairly accurate with sort of an initial estimation period before we went on to sort of validate the model to make sure that it was accurate and not sort of bad, right? So we wanted to be able to make sure we could do this well. I'm happy to talk with people about this separately, but if this is something you are interested in and you haven't used before, I suggest checking it out. I'll go ahead and show you the results from this. And again, keep in mind what we are interested in is are embezzlements, or do we forecast embezzlements to be increasing over time, again, possibly as a result of that casino that opened here. And so what I'm showing you here is on the x-axis, sorry, the y-axis, that's the total number of weekly embezzlement crimes in Columbus. And on the x-axis is the month, okay? So it started off in January of 2011 and wrapped up in December of 2014. We did this because this was sort of the best time window available to us. The casino opened in, I believe, October of 2012. So it's sort of around the midpoint of that graph there. I apologize. I wish I would have marked that for you there, but you can sort of see on your screen where that might be. I apologize. The data are a little messy here, but that's just sort of the nature of data that you work with sometimes. The blue line there is the actual number of weekly embezzlements. Okay, so how many embezzlements, oh, excuse me, I'm doing monthly here. Average number of monthly embezzlements. How many monthly embezzlements were there from January 11 through December of 2014? And then that red line there is the model that we developed through SBSS to sort of try to predict or forecast crime in the future. If you look backwards, you can see that the red line lines up pretty closely with the blue line in a lot of places. And so if you look at the sort of various what's called model fit, right, which is how well does your prediction actually match what happened, it looks pretty good in retrospect. And then from there we built the forecast. So 6 months out, we don't want to go too far because this type of model builds on itself. And so, you know, if you get your first month way off, right, everything else is going to sort of be messed up. And if you can sort of look at that red line, it isn't really increasing over time. A lot of those sort of ups and downs are due to seasonal effects, which we try to model in there as well, but it doesn't really look to be increasing. And you can, if you just sort of look at that red line, it's more or less straight over time. To us, that really just suggests it doesn't quite look like these are increasing the way we might think they are. So that's sort of how we try to tackle that problem. And again, results from that, no evidence to suggest that they're increasing in Columbus. To sort of wrap up this project and just to sort of summarize it, right, so what we did was we used NIBRS data, wanted to inform hiring decisions for local law enforcement here in Columbus, one specific division. The very nature of working with people in the criminal justice system is that resources for people are limited, right? And that's why data, I think, can be so powerful, is that it enables you to make informed decisions. So in this case, if they need to hire somebody on, they really do want to make sure that economic crimes are going to be increasing, and if not, they might be able to take that money and spend it on something else that would be advantageous to them. The thing I wanted to mention is that we were approached by law enforcement to do this, so this was sort of based on networking and them being familiar with our office. That's really nice to have people come to you to be able to do this type of research. We are very grateful for that. And just again to sort of reiterate on one of the themes that we heard about last time from Stephanie and Sam, you know, sort of building these relationships and getting people to trust you is a good way to make progress in this arena. The last one is that this is sort of a lesson for me as a researcher, is that I really had to work to clarify what specific research question they had and you know, figure out what really mattered to people. You know, at first, I actually come from psychology, where I used to collect and run my own very strict experiments, and I'd throw people in a brain scanner and all that stuff, and I'd have a lot of control over everything, and I'd like to try to make sure everything's really well designed from an experimental standpoint. And then here, I got a little bit too caught up in that type of stuff. So this is sort of like the hopefully learn from my mistakes part, right? Well, you know, maybe we could compare this with other cities in Ohio, but all the other big cities that are demographically similar to Columbus, they all have casinos too, and in the neighboring states, you got different crime trends, and, you know, maybe people are embezzling in other cities, right, and not in Columbus, and, you know, just sort of for their purposes, they were just sort of very straight to the point. You know, we need to know, is this stuff increasing in Columbus so we can make hiring decisions? And sort of that was really the research question that we ended up getting at. You said maybe there was a potential cause, right, in terms of the casino, but even if it was due to something else and we saw an increase, they'd still want to hire people on. So really working to sort of clarify that research question is, you know, when this law enforcement officer really just sort of like, hey, here's what we need, that was really important to sort of push the project forward. So I invite you to open up conversation and dialogue with people if you are trying to use NIBRS data to solve their problems. Okay. So that's the first study. And then the second one I want to talk about is domestic violence homicides. So sort of switching gears here a little bit. One of the nice things about the office that I work in is that we're currently located within the Department of Public Safety, and that there's a lot of other organizations that work here. Within the Public Safety Department, I work for the Office of Criminal Justice Services, and we've got a couple of different divisions. You know, we administer federal funding to a whole bunch of different programs. And then we actually work closely with the Family Violence Prevention Center, which is a group that was established to be able to address serious family violence. The center itself works as a clearinghouse for public and private organizations and people throughout Ohio who really work to prevent different types of family violence. It's really focused around providing assistance to victims and making sure that people who are victims of crime get the resources and the support that they need to be able to move on. one of the really nice things about the organization is that it provides leadership for state and local efforts to reduce and prevent family violence in Ohio. The Family Violence Prevention Center has an advisory council that meets quarterly. And so this is sort of a collection of a lot of people who have been working in victim services and victim rights organizations for a number of years. And so these are sort of really the experts in the state. And they sort of really work together to try to develop policies that are useful sort of at a statewide level and help coordinate efforts and manage resources. And it's really just sort of a wonderful group of people who are very passionate about what they do, and which is, trying to help out victims. And so one of the things that we do is we go and our office tells people about the database that we have, NIBRS. And so, we were fortunate to be contacted by law enforcement for that last study, but it's also something we try to go out and promote, right? As we try to go out and let people know that we have access to this data and that we have people here who are capable of analyzing it and interpreting it for them, so that if they do have questions that they're not able to answer, maybe we could be a potential resource for them. And so we did a little presentation. We gave them some data on things like domestic violence and sexual assault issues that they work with very closely, let them know sort of what was happening within the state for those particular types of crimes. And then we got a question. So an individual, Diana Ramos-Reardon from the Supreme Court, wanted to know specifically how many domestic violence fatalities are there in Ohio every year, okay? And so this was the research question that we received. How many domestic violence fatalities are there in Ohio every year? And this has some important implications for these practitioners. I'm going to get into those in just a moment, but sort of initially that was the question that we set out to answer, right? So how many of these homicides are there? Okay, so that's what we're going to be working with here. And this is actually a thing that we can tackle with the NIBRS database. So we went ahead and pulled 2014 murder and non-negligent manslaughter incidents from our database. And so that's the code 09A if you're working with the NIBRS data, and that's again at the UCRs at the federal level too. So most people should have access to that if you're using NIBRS data. And then what we did was we went through and we used the suspect-victim relationship field to determine if an offense qualified as a domestic violence homicide. And I say offense there, I need to be more specific, and I'm falling into one of those traps I mentioned earlier. We are counting this based on victims, so number of victims of homicide here is sort of what we are basing this on. And we're doing it based on what their relationship was with the individual who's a suspect in the crime. This is actually a little bit more of a tricky and nuanced issue than I initially thought, because it sort of turns out that domestic violence and what sort of relationship you have to a victim is there are a lot of different sort of relationship types can be considered domestic violence, and that's sort of really been changing over time, right? So what I have here is just sort of a very is one page out of our NIBRS manual, and I think you'll find this in federal NIBRS manuals as well. And this is just suspect-victim relationship type. So what's the relationship like between the suspect, and what's the relationship like what's the relationship to the victim? And so there's a number of possible entries that sort of split out into those three different categories. You've, of course, got within family, so things like spouse or parent or child. I think those are all fairly immediately obvious to people that those relationship types will qualify as domestic violence. But what about things like grandparent or grandchild? I had a lot of back and forth with people about this, and it turns out it is in some situations, it is in other situations. And for the sake of completeness and to match another database that I used, I ended up including those. But this is really something that you're going to want to put some thought into, and I think if you're looking at this at the state level, you might want to consult your state statutes. There's other stuff like if you look outside the family, ex-spouse and things like homosexual partner would be included. Unfortunately, the homosexual partner tends to be very underreported. Those tend to end up as acquaintance or friend more often than not, at least within our state. And then boyfriend-girlfriend, too, we included as well. This is sort of like one of the newer type of additions to domestic violence. It meets a lot of the criteria of what it takes for something to be domestic violence. And if those individuals are living together, for example, that really just sort of falls specifically under that heading. So that's what we did. Is we looked at the victims of homicide for 2014, and we filtered out the cases that didn't sort of meet our relationship criteria, and that gave us some information on domestic violence homicides, which is the question that we set out to answer. Now, I want to keep continuing to talk about some of the methods that we did, that we utilized here, because how do we account for underreporting and how do we account for data quality, right? So some of the things we want to make sure we keep in the forefront of our mind. Well, there's actually a really nice database that we have here in Ohio called the National Violent Death Reporting System, and this is actually a national database maintained by the CDC that's in more than 30 states now, I believe. So the Center for Disease Control, the CDC, has really been pushing this database, and it's really trying to get states on board with it. And this is a really nice data set that has information on violent death. So violent deaths typically include things like homicides, which are very useful for our case, things like suicides, things like accidents, accidents being things like, for example, drug overdose information is included in this database. So it's sort of a really, really rich data set that overlaps in a couple of different places with information that might be useful to people using NIBRS data. At least for my purposes, I've compared the information from our database to this database in terms of homicides for the current project, and then also in terms of drug overdose information for some other work that I've done. And so this is sort of a really nice resource here. I'm going to go ahead and put a link into it, or I actually already had went ahead and put a link to it at the end of this PowerPoint. And so if you're interested in reading more about it, maybe trying to figure out where it's housed in your state, you should be able to do that. I'm actually going to Boston tomorrow to go to a training workshop to learn a little bit more about this reporting system. So hopefully I'll be able to answer any and all questions that you have when I get back next week, if you're curious about the National Violent Death Reporting System. But again, the reason I mention this is that this has complete homicide data, and it allows for the comparison of our data set to this data set. So that way we don't have to worry too much about underreporting or data quality or some of the issues that I raised in the beginning. And so this is sort of a nice way for us to sort of be able to address any of those issues to see if it's really a problem. So what we did is we went ahead and we calculated the domestic violence homicide rate based on the information in our database and information based on the database here in Ohio. So I guess that would be the Ohio Violent Death Reporting System. The system hasn't been around all that long here in Ohio. I think it was established in 2010, or at least they started collecting data for the full calendar year of 2010. In that first year, they had maybe 15 counties reporting. So they got data from things like law enforcement and coroners and medical examiners, that type of thing. From those, I believe, 15 counties, the next year they had about 30-something counties. And then by their third year, they actually had full reporting. So they managed to go from just 15 counties out of 88 all the way up to complete reporting in pretty much no time at all, which is remarkable. And that provides a wonderful set of data that can be utilized. And so we took their data from 2010 to 2012, and 2012 was the most recent data that they had. And we just compared the domestic violence homicide rate to what we had. And so here's that sort of information at a glance. And the table right there shows domestic violence homicide rate per 100,000, the NVDRS, or what I should probably call the OVDRS rate there, and the NIBRS rate, and the percent difference between them. And basically what I wanted to do there was just sort of compare the two to get a sense from where's our database at. Particularly for 2012, when they had complete data in the NVDRS database, I wanted to see how close our database got. And there's a couple things you'll probably notice here. The differences in that column are all fairly small, so that's very reassuring for us. So it makes us feel a little bit better about our data. From here on out, I'm going to be reporting things like frequencies in terms of percentage rather than raw numbers as sort of a way of dealing with us having incomplete data. The other thing you might notice is that the domestic violence homicide rate in Ohio is pretty low, less than 1 per 100,000 population. This is fairly consistent with other figures that I've seen. Some states have it around 1 or 2 per 100,000. Thankfully, we live in a society where, homicide tends to be fairly rare in most areas, at least relative to other types of crime. And so, for some people, they might look at this and say, oh, well, it's not that big of an issue. It doesn't necessarily happen all that frequently. But if you look within just homicides in Ohio, it turns out that almost 1 in 5 homicides were related to domestic violence, or what we're calling domestic violence homicides. And that's a pretty substantial amount of the homicides. And if you're like me, you tend to think homicide is a very serious offense, and maybe out of all crimes, perhaps the most serious offense. And if you can find a good portion of those that are related to a specific type of problem, in this case domestic violence, maybe you can figure out a way to intervene or to understand these crimes at a very specific level. That's one of the nice things actually about working with a limited number of crimes is that you can really get into some detail about it and analyze it at a very specific level. And so I think based on that, we decided to dig into this data set to see what we had. So that was our work from 2010 to 2012 to sort of validate the information that we had in our database. And then moving forward, I just wanted to look at 2014 just to get a sense for what things were like. And here I'm just going to go ahead and show you a couple of graphs for the information we came up with and discuss a couple implications here. So what we have here is a relationship type, okay, between suspect and victim for domestic violence homicides. And then the bottom there, the x-axis, is the percentage of all cases that had that relationship type. The most frequent that you see is boyfriend and girlfriend, which is interesting that this is such a high type of domestic violence homicides when, up until just sort of recently, it wasn't really considered a form of domestic violence. So I think that's pretty interesting. Child, spouse, parent, all stuff that you see in domestic violence homicides and other family, as well as that last category that I had there. Just again, sort of showing you the frequency with which these things have occurred. One thing I wanted to do was take a look at some of the sex and race of victims here, just as a way of comparing fatal cases to both non-fatal cases and then the overall Ohio population. There's a lot to this graph, and I need one more drink of water, so I'm going to let you sort of take this in for a quick second. Okay, so on the y-axis there is the sort of percentage of all cases. So for the blue line, that's the percentage of all fatal cases. For the red line, that's the percentage of all non-fatal cases. And the green is just the percent of Ohio population. Okay. On the bottom there, you have from left to right, white females, black females, white males, and black males, and then another group that I had just because I didn't want to have to slice the data out too far. I wanted to have a big enough sample in that last category as well for comparison. And so what you can do is you can just sort of look at the data and see cases where the percentage of fatal and non-fatals match the Ohio population and cases where they don't. And that tells you which populations are sort of more at risk for domestic violence and domestic violence homicides as well. So let's just start there on the left. White females make up close to 45%, or more like 43%, sorry, of the Ohio population. Just to sort of give you a sense what our demographics are like. However, they make up over 45% of non-fatal domestic violence cases. What's interesting is that they tend to be a little bit less likely to be victims of fatal domestic violence. You sort of see that offset by white males who are much less likely to be victims of domestic violence just sort of in general, specifically non-fatal domestic violence. But if you look at that blue line, they're a little bit more likely to be victims of fatal domestic violence. Of course, the populations who tend to be overrepresented here, again, if you're comparing that green line for the black females, you see that they're overrepresented for both fatal and non-fatal domestic violence, as well as for black males as well, who are particularly overrepresented there among fatal domestic violence cases. So that's just sort of one way you can sort of break this information out here, and I probably should have cited this. I'm just using census data that we have available for the Ohio population and comparing it to the sex and race of different categories of people who are victims here. Weapon usage I thought was interesting to compare fatal versus non-fatal. In most domestic violence cases, personal weapons get used, personal weapons being things like hands or feet or teeth, close to 90% of the time. Firearms, that's the top line there. You see for non-fatal, they only make up about 1% of non-fatal domestic violence cases, but homicides are closer to 35% of all fatal domestic violence cases. So, something you might be able to take away from this is that Firearms are used fairly rarely in domestic violence in Ohio, but when it is used, it's one of the most frequent ways that somebody dies from that incident. This sort of meshes well with risk assessment work that has shown having a firearm in the house is a big predictor of domestic violence and of potential domestic violence homicides. So this sort of helps you maybe isolate a population that could be at risk here. Location of fatal and non-fatal domestic violence. Again, your y-axis here is just the percentage of all cases, and then you've got the blue line for fatal, the red line for non-fatal. You can see it's pretty well equal across both fatal and non-fatal cases. What I just wanted to show here is that domestic violence frequently occurs in residential structures. So again, this is something else that we have in our NIBRS database, is we have information on weapon type like I just showed you and location type. You know, within location type, that's a broad category. You've got different types of residential structures within that. I just sort of collapsed it, you know, combining things like single dwelling homes and multiple dwelling homes and that type of thing. But what this really shows you is that domestic violence is a fairly private crime. It takes place out of the eye of the public generally, inside a residential structure, and that's one of the reasons that perhaps it gets so underreported. Is that, you know, people aren't there to bear witness to it. So, like other types of crimes, for example, you can imagine motor vehicle thefts occurring almost exclusively outside or perhaps in a garage. So again, just sort of giving you some information about people who might be victimized and, you know, what can we learn from this type of thing. Day of the week information tends to increase and be fairly frequent on Saturday and Thursday. It's actually 3 o'clock now, so I'm going to speed up just a little bit so we can have enough time for questions at the end here. One thing I did want to show people, and this is for people who do research with time of day stuff, there's a group here in Columbus called Community Research Partners that developed this really nifty calendar visualization template. And this is from some old data that I put together from 2012, and this is just daily frequency of domestic violence, not for homicide specifically, just domestic violence in general. I don't have the key up there for you, but basically it sort of splits out each day of the year, and it sort of marks if it's in the top 20%, the sort of middle 20%, or the bottom 20%. Obviously I'm missing 40% there, but which quintile in terms of frequency domestic violence occurrences, you know, it falls into, right? So the darker the color on that calendar, the more frequent domestic violence is to be on that day. And I really like this tool because, number one, it's free, and number two is it sort of gives you a really nice snapshot just by glancing at it when certain crimes tend to occur. I've talked a couple times about the seasonal effect of crime, and that tends to be fairly obvious. If you look in that middle row, May, June, and July, that all tends to be fairly dark, very frequently occurring. Crimes occurring on the weekend as well tends to be fairly common. So that's another main time that it tends to happen, with winter crime tending to be a little bit more sparse in terms of domestic violence. So I think this is a really neat tool. I've got a link to this in the resource section. So if you're somebody that works with NIBRS data and you're trying to really show how this stuff is occurring over the course of the year, you can go ahead and look at it. You know, even do things like look at, you know, when on holidays is this stuff occurring. Okay, so I just want to talk briefly about some of the implications and sort of why are we doing this detailed analysis of something that might be fairly infrequent. Well, one of the big initiatives, and something that there's actually some evidence to show that it's effective in reducing domestic violence homicide, is the establishment of statewide domestic violence homicide or fatality review boards. So these are groups of individuals who are experts who come together and review cases of domestic violence fatality to see sort of why it happened or what went wrong. This is done not to place blame on any particular organization or any individual. It's to see if there are any gaps in resources that need to be filled by service providers. So for example, if somebody was a victim of domestic violence, a fatality, but they never got in touch with a local shelter or law enforcement or anything like that, that might be one issue that gets potentially identified. If that individual did get in touch but sort of fell out of the system at some point along the line, you know, maybe declined to prosecute at one point, that's something else that could be paid attention to as well. And from that, these boards can sort of analyze these cases, learn from what happened, and hopefully use the information they learn to save lives in the future. And I think some of the information that we get out of the NIBRS data set says that you know, you can really sort of delve into these cases and maybe review them in some detail. That might actually be a good thing, and there's some evidence that fatality review boards are effective. You can use it to inform practitioners and reinforce best practices, right? So I'm looking at the state level with NIBRS data here, but of course I could split this out by a different county, and I can compare county-wide data to census data. And by looking at census data, I might get an information on populations that tend to be under or overrepresented. That's something people would want to know. For example, funding decisions, I think this type of information is very useful. There's, again, like I mentioned, just limited resources in this arena sometimes, and if you're going to be funding programs and that type of thing, it's good to really sort of see where the biggest needs are and sort of what types of programs will have the most, the largest effect. There's some good work out there with risk assessment. I think some of the things that I've come across here in the NIBRS data set have validated all that. So in terms of things like alcohol use being a major predictor of domestic violence, and I think perhaps for domestic violence homicide in general, though I'm not entirely sure about that, something that could be looked at using NIBRS data. And if you see increases in alcohol-related domestic violence occurrences, that might be evidence that it's a pretty severe risk to happening at a statewide level. And also things like program evaluation. So if you're deploying resources and you want to see how effective they are, you can use NIBRS data for that. That doesn't have to be for domestic violence homicide. That can just sort of be in general. Okay. So one more thing, and I just want to have a few concluding remarks here. The NIBRS database structure is really flexible. I've been trying to demonstrate that. I've said that a couple times. It's a really, really useful database structure. It's a good way to structure your data. It's sort of a really good way to think about crime because it seems fairly comprehensive to me. And there's a local victims' rights organization here that's called the Justice League of Ohio that was putting together an online toolkit for informing victims of their legal rights, okay? And so victims of crime have a whole host of legal rights. Sometimes they need to specifically request those rights. Other times they might accidentally waive them just sort of in the course of whatever trauma they've been through. And so they're really sort of promoting an online toolkit as a way to make sure that people are aware of their rights after they've been a victim of a crime. They needed to know some information from these people because some of the rights that you have are dependent on certain demographic characteristics, like if you're a minor or if, for example, certain types of crimes also give you certain rights that you have as a result of that. So they needed some organized structure for understanding all this information, and they actually went ahead and took the NIBRS database and sort of applied the same structure to their forms and their intake forms where they sort of make sure people know about their rights by providing the certain types of information that they need demographically. One of the nice things about this is that, and actually go ahead and show you, I had Andy Franks, the guy who's been working on putting this thing together. And again, that's the Justice League of Ohio if you want to check this thing out. I think this is beta testing right now. This is an example of what they have in their database, and this is sort of, I think, the back end of what he's showing me. And you've got things like the NIBRS code included in there for all those different types of offenses, and this just served as a nice way for them to organize their database. I guess the reason I put all this stuff in here is because as follows. I know that sometimes different groups of people or different stakeholders want to go ahead and collect their own data, but they're not quite sure where to start, right? What's the best starting point, or how do we organize this stuff? If they're collecting data related to crime, NIBRS is sort of a good format to be able to mirror and copy. You know, for some reasons, like it's already established, so you can have a nice reference point for it. It works federally, so there's a whole bunch of applications across all the different states, and it's not just sort of tied directly to one state. And then for some databases, it'll facilitate comparison across, you know, multiple different types of data sets. So that's just sort of why I wanted to mention this here is one other possible use for NIBRS data. Go ahead, taking the structure and then applying that to people who are trying to collect new data for their programs. Okay. So working with local organizations, I just have two more slides here sort of concluding things. Thanks again for your time and your patience, folks. I see almost everybody stuck around, and I'm very grateful for that and looking forward to all your questions here. I guess one of the themes that I've tried to bring up here, and one of the themes that we've seen in a couple JRSA webinars here recently, right, the idea of building relationships within your community. The law enforcement project that we worked on with the casino mostly came about because they were familiar with us. The domestic violence project and working with the victims' rights toolkit, that came about because we went out and we told people about our database and we offered our help, and they had questions that it turned out that we were able to address and help them answer. So that's good. On the same side of the coin, that's just letting people know what resources you have available, right? Because sometimes data can be used for them to make informed decisions. Like I talked about with law enforcement, it's good to help specify and clarify research questions so that you're providing information that the people really need to be able to make their decisions, and you need to present results in an easy-to-understand way. So taking data and being able to sort of synthesize all that information and distill it to something that people are able to easily understand if they don't have a background in stats or the experimental sciences is pretty important to be able to do as well. So those are just sort of things that I've learned and were mostly pitfalls that I sort of made along the way, and I'm hopefully going to help you guys not make those same mistakes if you work with NIBRS data. Conclusions, yeah, NIBRS data is very useful. Networking is helpful. The main thing I want to harp on is that last point. And again, I've seen people have concerns about NIBRS data, data quality issues, you know, that type of stuff. There are some issues with it. It's not a perfect data set. But when you work with crime data is sort of by definition not perfect, right? Some of it goes unreported. So right off the bat, if you're working with crime data, you know it's not perfect information, and you can sort of live with that. And there are things you can do, right, in terms of imputation methods or validation through other types of databases that'll make things better. And so you can sort of overcome these issues. I wanted to highlight a couple of them and hopefully show you a couple ways to work with them. I've got resources here in the slides. So I've got NIBRS data quality stuff, the people from West Virginia, the YouTube link to their JRSA webinar, and it's also available on the resources section of the JRSA website if you just want the PowerPoint. SPSS forecasting, this isn't the greatest link. I actually found a better one after I went ahead and submitted my slides, but I think this one's going to make you give them your email address, but they have all sorts of information about SPSS forecasting if you're interested in how to build those models. National Violent Death Reporting System, here's a link. That calendar visualization tool that I showed you briefly, here's a link to that if you want it. It works out of Excel. And the last one is this paper, 8 Benefits of NIBRS to Victim Service Providers. Sort of a very, very nice resource for people if you want to use NIBRS data to help people who are in the sort of area of victim service providers. At least I know from personal experience, that's an area where we've really been able to sort of help people out using NIBRS data. So, went on for a while here, but that's all I have. If anybody has any questions, feel free to let us know. And Angie, I think I'll go ahead and turn it back over to you here for a moment. Okay,
thank you, Alan. We'll answer questions in just a moment from the participants. Remember to send those to the chat feature, and we'll get those answered for you. Before I start asking the questions, we're going to open up a poll and would appreciate your participation. This helps us evaluate the webinar and gives us ideas on other topics for future webinars. So if you all would take a moment to work on that, and then submit your questions via the chat feature so we can get them going.
I guess one thing I wanted to mention while we wait for questions to roll in is my contact information, my email address is up there. I am going to be out of town at a conference for the next couple of days, but if you have any questions about anything I've talked about here, I'm more than happy to email you back and forth or to even have a phone chat about this stuff. So just again, wanted to offer myself up as a resource to people who have any questions or anything like that after the webinar here.
I do have some questions coming in. We'll go ahead and I'll start asking those. We have one question that says that they are working a lot on mapping lately, and they wanted to know if there are geocoded data in NIBRS.
Yes, so there are geocoded data in NIBRS, and your success with it might be kind of variable. So at least with our database, I've had a lot of success geocoding stuff at like the zip code level or the county level. The stuff in our database for that all tends to be fairly accurate. For the address level, it is a little bit more hit or miss. Sometimes it'll depend on the agency, the quality of data that you get from that field, but at least for us, and I do believe this is in the NIBRS system, and it's not just exclusive to OIBRS, that there is address level information submitted. You'll have to geocode that yourself. I know some law enforcement agencies have already geocoded information, but that tends to be fairly rare. The address level information, like I said, can be hit or miss. So you're going to have to do a little bit of manual geocoding, and sometimes you'll get, stuff like it was, this homicide occurred at the Wendy's on Market Street, and you have to sort of go in and figure out which one that might be. But certainly at the county level, at the zip code level, and then depending on where you're looking at specifically, you could probably even come away with some very easy addresses to geocode if you sort of comb through your database and try to find a law enforcement agency that reports that stuff very well.
Okay, thank you. Another question is, how do you see participation with INDEX and NIBRS? If the state agency is using the INDEX IEPD to submit data to the FBI, what would the steps be to becoming a NIBRS, I guess they'd be NIBRS certified agency?
Yep.
So, yeah, and also, what steps are NIBRS to becoming INDEX partners?
So this is actually one of the questions that got sent in ahead of time, and so I asked around a little bit here in Ohio, and the sort of short answer is that this is going to vary by state. So you're going to have to talk to whoever in your state administers NIBRS or whoever administers INDEX, and that's N-DEX, not INDEX, because I know we talk about INDEX crimes with the NIBRS database sometimes. But in general, it should work both ways, right? So if you have INDEX, there are tools out there that will allow you to do NIBRS reporting. If you have a NIBRS reporting system, there are tools out there, I've been told, now I haven't done this myself, but there are tools out there that will allow you to report through or include that information through INDEX to sort of hook that up. I get the sense from what I've heard is that it's a little bit easier to go from INDEX to NIBRS than the other way around, just because NIBRS information is de-identified. So you don't have any sort of identifiable information in there. The problem is that with INDEX contains very sensitive information, and so it's a little bit more difficult, I think, maybe, to go from just doing NIBRS data to go to doing that. But having said that, I looked into it, and there are resources available, but the problem is that it varies by state. So I don't know if I can give you a very specific answer on how that might work in your state. I'd suggest contacting the person in charge of either NIBRS or INDEX, and should be able to help you from there, hopefully.
Okay, and then the other question that came in ahead of time was the comment on how much of this applies to those UCR states. So they have both NIBRS and UCR jurisdictions in their state. So if it says if Ohio's NIBRS base leaves you unable to relate to UCR, then they understand that. But can you talk about that a little, UCR and NIBRS?
Yeah, absolutely. So some of the stuff that I talked about here today you wouldn't be able to do with UCR. One of the whole reasons that they sort of switched over to NIBRS is that it contains a greater amount of detail than you might get out of UCR. So some information types will be lost. If you're trying to do some of the stuff with just like raw crime counts, I think you could be able to use UCR data to have that happen. Though I do work mostly from the NIBRS database here, and I only am sort of familiar with UCR in the form of that it gets collected and delivered in. So if it's not the case, I apologize.
Well, you guys are fortunate that you have the larger agencies in your incident-based reporting system. You're definitely fortunate that way.
Yeah.
Do you have any other questions?
I was just going to say it tends to be the reverse from what I've heard, is that usually smaller agencies, from what I've heard, tend to be more likely to report to NIBRS than the larger ones. I think we really have an excellent law enforcement liaison here in Ohio, Jim Lubers, and he actually reaches out to the big agencies, and I think he's helped get them on board with NIBRS. And from a data analysis standpoint, it's absolutely terrific that we've been able to get most of those big agencies to participate here, since I know that's not always quite the case.
Yeah, you guys are fortunate that way, definitely. Well, I don't see any other questions. Does anyone else have any questions? In that case, once again, I'd like to thank our presenter, Alan Webb, as well as everyone in the audience for joining us today. We hope that you enjoyed today's presentation, and you can look for this webinar to be posted within the next few days on JRSA's website at www.jrsa.org. And thanks again for joining us, and hope you have a great afternoon.